Humanitarians and civilians should never be paying the consequences of war.
This doesn't seem anymore a war about defending Israel. This really, at this point, seems it's a war against humanity itself.
You cannot be targeting humanitarian. You cannot be targeting children. You cannot be fighting the basis of what humanity should be standing for.
Jose Andress is a celebrity chef and the founder of a charity called World Central Kitchen, which provides food aid in humanitarian crises around the world, from Africa and Central America to Australia after deadly bushfires. Now, Andress's rage against Israel has turned him into a lightning rod for global concern about the war in Gaza. Why is he so angry? Because 7 of his workers were killed in an Israeli airstrike last week, including Australian Zomi Frankham.
At least one Australian is among 5 aid volunteers reportedly killed in an airstrike on Gaza. The employees were from World Central Kitchen, which is, of course, an organisation which provides food for displaced Palestinians.
The images that emerged from that strike were horrifying. 3 vehicles were destroyed, at least one with a huge hole in its roof where a projectile had entered at massive speed. Israel initially called it a tragic accident, something that happens in war. But WCK said their unarmed civilian workers had cleared their itinerary and route with the Israeli Defence Forces before setting out. Jose Andress said he just didn't believe this was an accident. In an essay for the New York Times published 2 days later, Andress responded to the attack. We've used a voice actor to bring you his words.
Israel is better than the way this war is being waged. It is better than blocking food and medicine to civilians. It is better than killing aid workers who had coordinated their movements with the Israel Defense Forces.
There's a famous saying often attributed to the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, but never proven to have been actually said by him, that if one man dies of hunger, that's a tragedy. If millions die, that's just a statistic. Whether Stalin said it or not, and he certainly presided over the deaths of millions during the USSR's brutal decades of mass imprisonments, deportations and political purges, there's a resonance to that saying in this moment. The war in Gaza has been going for 6 months, ever since Hamas militants, allegedly including some workers employed by the United Nations agency working in Gaza, came over the border and massacred Israelis. Babies, grandparents, women and children were murdered in peaceful farming communities. Young women were raped and killed at a music festival. Soldiers died at military bases. Since then, there have been so many images of death in Gaza, in the rubble of devastated buildings, in the hospitals where Gazans gathered to shelter from the onslaught, as Israel sought to destroy Hamas's senior leadership and eliminate the tunnels under Gaza where they hide. So why has this incident galvanised opinion in a way countless images of rubble and devastation could not? A big part of the reason is Zomi Frankham. Zomi, with her long, dark hair and huge friendly smile, was one of the World Central Kitchen aid workers killed. She'd previously worked for WCK in Asia and Africa. Here she is in a video posted to their social media channels a week before the strike.
Hey, this is Zomi and Chef Olivier. We're at the Jirabala kitchen and we've got the Mise en Place. Tell us a little bit about it, Chef Ali.
Her family says she was an outstanding woman who lived to serve others.
Indeed, so this is the beautiful, fragrant, aromatic rice that will be served today from Jirabala kitchen. Thank you.
I think in a way, for some countries, certainly for the US, it was the straw that broke the camel's back as far as moving to a different place where they've gone from almost uncritical support for Israel to saying, listen, we have a real problem with some of the aspects of the conduct of the war.
Ceron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent.
And I think the reason why they focus so much on this tragedy is there is a suspicion that Israelis, the IDF, has simply not given enough care and cause and thought to protecting civilian casualties, despite what the West is increasingly calling for.
The US and Australia both immediately expressed outrage. Here's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
The truth is that this is beyond any reasonable circumstances. Someone going about providing aid and humanitarian assistance should lose their life. This is a human tragedy that should never have occurred, that is completely unacceptable. And Australia will seek full and proper accountability, as you would expect, for how this could have occurred.
And in Israel, thousands joined rallies to protest against Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership and conduct of this war, and to call for an immediate ceasefire. The families of some of the hostages still held in Gaza were also at the rallies, urging members of Israel's parliament, the Knesset, to boot Netanyahu out. They say the PM has deliberately sabotaged efforts to bring the hostages home.
I think the rest of the world perhaps wants to be sure of the transparency here. But I think it just shows the ebbing trust and empathy towards the IDF in some quarters here, that some countries wanted more answers to see how this could actually happen, because certainly at face value, the notion of this convoy being targeted when they had approval and everyone supposedly knew what they were doing is a fairly astonishing mistake. It's a very big mistake, and you hear about 3 cars and 3 missiles. It wasn't just a one-strike mistake. And so I think it's understandable that countries, especially if they've lost their own nationals, would really ask for a lot of detail, but it reflects a growing frustration among many countries about Israel's broader conduct of the war. And this was a glaring example of a mistake that should never have happened. And I guess a lot of countries are asking, look, how many more of these mistakes are happening that simply aren't being reported, aren't being focused on, which has obviously contributed to the very high civilian death toll. So if you like, this tragedy really pricked a sensitivity that was already there with Western countries like Australia and Britain and Europe and the United States.
Australia's now appointed Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, a former Chief of Defence here, to be Special Advisor to the government on Israel's response to the disaster. Firstly, Cam, what does that mean? What's he going to be doing? And secondly, there's an interesting question about Australia's role in global affairs here. Of course, from our perspective, we think we're very important. How much is Australia's appointing of a special envoy meaningful or resonant in Israel itself?
It's almost like a symbolic message rather than something that will actually achieve a concrete result, in the sense that Australia is effectively saying to the Israelis, look, listen, we want more transparency. We want to make sure that everything possible was looked at. This is one of our nationals who has died. And I think that that is the message they want to send the Israelis, how serious Australia takes this loss of life. I am sceptical personally that Mark Binskin is very good, a former Australian Defence Chief, no reflection on him, but I'm very sceptical that this will lead to any great revelations. I think it is more of a symbolic message that Australia is giving to Israel, that it is watching the conduct of the war, and Australia's support and level of support is going to be slightly contingent now on the conduct and the way that Israel is fighting this war. And in fact, that's a message that was very much mirrored in the United States with the United States Secretary of State Blinken, who said at the weekend that Israel's priority now must be protection of civilians first, ahead of the military operation. And that is a very big statement for the United States to make. And I think that's the general mood that we're talking about with the reaction to this tragedy.
Coming up, what does Israel and the world do now? On April 11 in Melbourne, Ceron Stewart and Yoni Bashan will join me for a special event for subscribers to the Australian Plus. It's a live conversation about Israel, Gaza, anti-Semitism and the geopolitical forces shaping our world. There'll be a chance to ask questions and to join us for canapes and a drink afterwards. To register, go to theaustralianplus.com.au/events. We'll be back after this break. Francesca Albanese, a senior UN staffer with responsibility for the Palestinian territories, has suggested the Israeli Defence Forces are deliberately targeting humanitarian workers in order to starve the people of Gaza. Here's Ceron Stewart.
I don't think there's any credible evidence at all to suggest that that's true. I mean, this is a disaster for Israel. The loss of the 7 lives of those aid workers is a PR disaster for Israel across the world. They're going to pay diplomatically for it. In a lot of ways, it is just not the sort of thing that a country like Israel would do, in my opinion, deliberately. What it does do is focus on the humanitarian shortcomings of Israel as far as supplying aid into Gaza. That's a different question to deliberately targeting humanitarian aid workers. I just don't think there is any evidence to do that. And I think simple logic would tell you that wouldn't be in Israel's interest anyway.
Until now, Israel hasn't really admitted fault about the distribution of humanitarian aid. It has said that it is allowing trucks through, that delays are not its fault. What do you think we can say now about the provision of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza?
I think it obviously needs to be increased dramatically. I mean, the United States doesn't accept that Israel is doing everything it can to get aid into the territory. It has called on the government, Benjamin Netanyahu, to do far more, to open more crossings, to send more aid in. The Americans, of course, are trying to build an inroad into bringing aid in from the Mediterranean into Gaza. So the Americans are now really stepping up the accelerator when it comes to getting aid into the enclave. But I think this is a problem for Israel. I actually think Israel would be much better served to really, really press the accelerator when it comes to getting more aid into Gaza, because if Israel wants to win more hearts and minds around the world, that is absolutely the best way to do it. And you do have a genuine humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And I think that what you're seeing from Israel is a lot of tardiness early on with getting aid into Gaza. And I think that they are improving, but there's still a long way to go.
Just finally, Cam, the United Kingdom has threatened to stop selling weapons to Israel if it's proven that it's broken international law. Is that the kind of language that is going to make a difference here, where pleas for humanitarian aid have not?
Look, it may to some degree. There's also debate, of course, in the United States. Some elements of the Democratic Party want Joe Biden to restrict military aid to Israel as well. I mean, certainly any decision by Britain or America to do that would be fairly catastrophic for Israel. And so you think it would be a fairly strong lever and pressure to Israel to at least modify its policies. But I am very sceptical that either Britain or America would do that. In the end, Israel is a lone democracy amongst a bunch of countries that want to get rid of it. And I just don't think it would ever go that far, even though it might be waived as a potential lever. I just don't think it would be implemented.
Ceron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. We've got more detail today in The Australian about the boatload of Chinese nationals who arrived undetected off WA's Kimberley coast at the weekend. That story was first broken by The Australian's Paige Taylor, and she's leading the nation in reporting all the latest developments. You can check out all Paige's reporting by subscribing now at theaustralian.com.au.